Hi, everyone. This is Jaime Alejandro with the Arts Calling podcast, the place where I interview hardworking independent creatives in the literary, visual, and performing arts. One quick reminder, if you look at the episode description, I have one weekly shout-out listed, so be sure to check out those links. There's exciting projects from previous guests, new publications, podcasts, and other independent projects from previous guests and friends of the show. Once again, thank you for checking out those links, and thank you for stopping by the Arts Calling podcast. Now let's get on with the show. Today, I am delighted to be Arts Calling author Merrill Joan Gerber. Let me tell you about our guest. Merrill Joan Gerber has written 30 books, including The Kingdom of Brooklyn, winner of the Ribalow Award from Hadassah Magazine, and King of the World, winner of the Pushcart Editors Book Award. Her fiction has been published in The New Yorker, the Sewanee Review, The Atlantic, Mademoiselle, and Redbook, and her essays in The American Scholar, Salmagundi, and Commentary. She has won an O. Henry Award, a Best American Essays Award, and a Wallace Stegner Fiction Fellowship to Stanford University. She retired in 2020 after teaching writing at the California Institute of Technology for 32 years. Her literary archive is now at the Yale Beinecke Rare Book Library. And for some background, let me share a little bit about Merrill's collection of essays, Revelation at the Food Bank. These powerful essays share critical moments of a writer's life, scenes from 60 years of passionate married love, suicides faced and suicide contemplated, trauma at the DMV, a night lost searching for a harpsichord in the mountains of Florence, Italy, the tale of a beloved cousin whose plane is shot down by Japanese Zeros, and a precious friendship between two women writers, derailed by the poisons of religion and politics. In the titular essay included in Best American Essays 2023, A Food Bank, Assuaging the Pandemic's Terrors with Gifts of Food and Prayers, becomes a portal for intimate confidences entrusted to us by a voice of unspoiled authenticity and perennial vigor. Folks, this was a phenomenal conversation for me. I was so deeply moved by Merrill's story and how she shared some wonderful memories and highlights from her extensive and impressive career. She also shared insights about the writing life that you definitely don't want to miss. And I must say, the writing in her latest publication is so intimate, honest, and memorable that to listen to her elaborate on the themes of this collection was an absolute treat. So I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Again, the collection is Revelation at the Food Bank, now available from Sagging Meniscus Press. So without further delay, let's give Merrill a call. Good afternoon, Merrill. How are you today?
I'm fine at the moment and happy to see you and glad we connected. I'm doing okay considering that I'm recovering from a fall I had a couple of months ago, actually.
Oh, goodness.
But we have to be careful at this age.
Absolutely. So more than anything, thank you so much for your time. I'm just delighted to get to connect with you for a little bit and talk about your latest work, Revelation at the Food Bank, from Sagging Meniscus Press. Before we get to it, though, I'd like to check in with you and see if we could start at the beginning, because there's a tremendous journey here that you've kind of laid a path for me in our conversation over email that I think would be interesting to cover before we get into the publication. Do you mind if we go back to the beginning there?
Sure. Go right ahead.
Can you tell me a bit about growing up in the East Coast and that big move that you made to Miami Beach? It seemed like it was something that happened at a very seminal time in your life. Can you share a bit about that time?
Sure. I grew up in Brooklyn and lived in a house with my mother, father, sister, and my grandmother and my maiden aunt. And I lived there for the first 14 years of my life. And it was, as they say, that's home. Those are the years where you learn to be who you are. You learn to understand what other people are thinking and feeling. And they were very critical years for me. And when I was 14, my parents decided, because my sister and I had had pneumonia several times, that they wanted to move to a warmer climate. And they packed us up and we moved to Miami Beach, where my father looked for several businesses to be in. He had originally been in the antique business. And in fact, up here in my office, there's the sign that says Gerber's Antiques, which was the name of my father's store in Brooklyn. And then when he got to Florida, he always called himself Gerber's Antiques. Then in Florida, I went to high school in Miami Beach High School. And the day before I turned 16, I met my husband to be. And we are now coming up to our 64th anniversary, June 23rd. So
Wow.
we made a long haul together, he and I. And from the university, from Miami Beach High School, I went to the University of Florida in Gainesville, Florida, where I met an incredibly brilliant writing teacher named Andrew Lyell. He was one of the great Southern gentlemen, among Alan Tate and many others who came from the South. And he became my mentor in a way. And there is an essay in my new book of essays called Letters Home from College, which were letters I actually wrote my mother almost every day from Gainesville. And I told her day by day what was happening in my life, and when I met Andrew Lyell and what his writing class was like. So I have this record, which of course I didn't know until I found the box of letters that said letters home from college, that I decided that it would be one of the essays that I could write about that time of my life.
Oh yeah, and that was an absolutely wonderful device that we kind of see popping up in the collection quite a bit. But I really want to get to it, but I feel like we need to kind of address that influence
Sure.
because he seemed to be a very important figure in your development. What were some major takeaways from that teaching relationship that allowed you to grow and really start taking confidence in your work and submitting and sending stuff out into the world?
Well, they say that if you have someone in your life, a teacher or a friend, not necessarily a relative, but someone who thinks you're terrific, you're gifted, you're able, you're powerful, and they tell you that in your early years, um, that can give you a lot of energy for following the path that you strike out on. And I think Andrew Lyell began to understand me. I thought I was a girl from Brooklyn, and here I was with this great Southern writer, and I thought he'll never understand anything about me because his whole life and his own history was so different from mine. But the fact is, he became a fatherly figure to me. And each time I wrote a story in his class and he read it aloud, sometimes the students read their own stories, other times Mr. Lyell would read the stories. And you could see in his eyes sometimes a sparkle that he sees some wonderful idea coming or some element in the story that he thinks is terrific. And you feel that sweet energy coming from him to you, and you think, I'm doing this the right way. And at some point, he wrote a book called, just let me, it just flew out of my mind. He was going to New York to talk to a publisher about his book. And he said to me, I'm going to take your story to the New Yorker and I'm going to give it to the editor there, my most recent story. The Velvet Horn was the name of his novel. And I lived that weekend thinking, oh, he's going to the New Yorker with my story. He's seeing an editor there. And then I thought, don't get up on that high dream. It's not going to happen. And when he came back, I was waiting for him to call me with the big news. And he did call me. He said, your editor was out of town. I brought your story back. Impossible for me to show it to him. That was early. That story wasn't going to be in the New Yorker. But I did have some stories, some sales to the New Yorker. from Wallace Stegner's class. We can get to that
Sure.
later when I was a Stanford fellow.
Yeah, and I love this just kind of momentum that a positive relationship like that can generate. I feel like sometimes you can come upon some professors or educators who are not as encouraging. So that must have come at the perfect time. So as you start submitting, what led you to the Wallace Stegner Fellowship that led you to Stanford? If we can just kind of pave the way to that event.
Well, when I was at the University of Florida, I knew there were two great writing places, the University of Iowa writing program and the Stanford writing program. And I thought about those things and wondered whether I would be a candidate for such a fellowship. And when I was at Gainesville, I applied to the University, to Iowa, the Iowa writing program. And I got back a letter saying they had accepted me and they would give me a $500 fellowship. Well, that didn't seem very much, even in those years, or to cover my trip to Iowa and the expenses. And furthermore, my parents said, it's freezing there. We don't want you to go so far away. So I gave up that idea. And after I graduated from the University of Florida, I got a fellowship to Brandeis University, where my husband was also studying. And I spent my master's study year at Brandeis University, which also has an interesting aspect to it. Irving Howe was then the head of the English department. And I had several brilliant friends who were in the department with me. And each time they took their oral exams, the women tended to fail them. And I looked at the reading list for the master's degree at that college, and it was like 15 pages long, and you needed to know all the English kings in order and all the plays of Shakespeare. And I thought, I'm not going to be able to pass this. So I finished my coursework at Brandeis, and I decided not to take the orals, and I decided to get a job. And I got a job at Houghton Mifflin Publishers in Boston for a year while my husband continued to study at Brandeis. And at the end of that year, I decided to apply to the Wallace Stegner Fellowship, which I did without much hope. As all of us who are writers know, you can apply to anything, anytime, and you know the odds are very poor. And around that time, as my husband was finishing up his work at Brandeis, I found that I was pregnant and I was going to have a baby in 1962, as it turned out. And I'd completely forgotten, not completely, I'd almost forgotten that I'd applied to Stanford. And 3 days before I was supposed to have my baby, I got this letter from Wallace Stegner saying, we're delighted to offer you this scholarship at Stanford, and we'll see you here in the fall. And of course, I was in a tremendous state of confusion because the baby was due. My husband had just accepted a job at a university in Boston, and he said to me, this is your chance. I think we should do it. I think you should take the fellowship. And I think we should go with our forthcoming baby to Stanford. So in May of that year, I had my first daughter. And 4 months later, I was at the airport with my husband and baby, and my parents had come up to Boston area to help us pack for this trip. And we got on a plane and we flew to Stanford. And there I was with an infant. And I remember there was a reception at Wallace Stegner's home where we were all invited in, the 4 new fellows that were. Robert Stone, by the way, was one of the other fellows in the year that I was a fellow. And we met Wallace Stegner, and he had very elite guests, writers, and friends at his party. And we began the year there. And that was the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Oh, wow.
And my husband, who was in the reserves of the Air Force, was called up to duty right then while we were at Stanford. And I was left alone with the baby.
Oh, my
And
goodness.
I was supposed to be writing in the workshop. Well, there were other people at the workshop. The men had wives who offered to take care of my baby, and I went to my classes there. And I wrote two major stories at Stanford under Stegner's leadership. And one of them was called A Daughter of My Own. And it was about a woman who gives birth, as I had recently done. And her mother comes to visit to, quote, help out. And it turned out that the mother's visit was not a helpful thing at all. She was intrusive. This is in real life. She wanted to take charge of the baby and told me not to nurse it. She would give it a bottle. And my feeling was during that time that this was going to be a devastating blow between my mother and me to our friendship. But when I got to Stanford, I thought, I'm going to write about this story. And I wrote it to the best of my knowledge and ability. And I sent it to Redbook magazine. I didn't have an agent. I just sent it to the Redbook. And within about 2 weeks, I got this letter saying they wanted to buy it. And they would pay me $1,000. Can you imagine? In those years, $1,000 was a real a fortune.
Mm-hmm.
And I forgot that my mother would then someday see this in Redbook in some supermarket. And I mean, I had no idea that I would sell it. And then I realized it was so personal. And then I realized it would break my mother's heart. And when I got the $1,000 check, I sent it to my mother. And I said, Mom, I just want to tell you, this is a piece of fiction. It's really not about us. Of course, every writer of fiction can claim that, and the truth will be told sooner or later. But my mother wrote me back and said, I'm proud of you. Whatever you want to write, we will be behind you. So that was a great relief to me. And it needed to be throughout my whole creative life, because many of the stories I wrote could have impinged or did, or people thought they did, impinge on others' lives. And you really can't worry about that while you're at your desk as a writer. You have to apply yourself to the work and the art that you're doing, and you can't worry about what your aunts and grandmothers are going to think. You have to take that stance. Otherwise, you would be afraid to write anything. So that year, then the second story I wrote at Stanford was based on a terrible loss that we had in our family. My father's brother suddenly died of a heart attack. And my husband and I went to the funeral in New York of my uncle. And I saw many powerful images, and I had many experiences in that during that time. And back at Stanford, I wrote a story called We Know That Your Hearts Are Heavy. And I sent it to the New Yorker. And magically, I got a letter again. They would be publishing it. And I thought, writing is going to be so easy from now on. All you do is type 15 pages, you get a big check. It's going to be a breeze from now on. Well, let me say, after that, many rejections found their way to me over many, many years. But that particular story was, in a way, a branching into the future for me, because once you publish in the New Yorker, you have a certain power, or you think you do, and you feel a certain confidence. And so while I was at Stanford, I wrote a number of stories, and they were later published in my first book of short stories called Stop Here, My Friend, which Houghton Mifflin published. And that was also a great pleasure and joy for me. have had that experience.
Right. And
And
as, oh, sorry, go ahead.
following on that, I mean, I had the nature to pay attention to personal histories of people and my own. And my daughter was born in 1962. My father, my father contracted leukemia in 1965,
Hmm.
and he died within a few months of this terrible disease. He was only 55 when he became ill. So my second book was called An Antique Man, and it was a novel that followed the history of my father's life and his illness and our family and what it meant to us. And that was also published by Houghton Mifflin. So I got started with some nice publishers and some really good reviews. I had lots of major reviews for that novel. So, and of course, after that, I've written 31 books.
Right.
So,
It
uh,
seemed like you needed the starting point to be a familiar one and use that kind of energy to bring that out into the world. Did it feel like it was floodgates opening into long form and you were able to kind of overcome something? Or was that just something that was an eventuality for you that you said, okay, I'm doing short stories for the time being, and eventually I'll just, continue with the long form? Or was there any trepidation
well,
at any point?
when you start publishing short stories, in those days, in the 60s, editors of publishing houses followed those literary journals where you might publish your short stories. And they would often write to a young writer, we're very interested in a novel you might write. So will you keep us in mind? And so they courted us. Um,
Wow.
it, it wasn't my plan to write a novel, but when I lived through the experience of my father's illness and death, um, I had to write this book. I didn't. I had a second child in 1965, and I wasn't really able to even take pictures of her or play with her when my father was so ill. And
Mm.
I thought if I don't capture some of these memories and feelings that I experienced to honor my father, who I loved very much, he was quite a remarkable, kind, loving person. I won't be able to enjoy my family. And so
Mm.
I actually felt that writing this book was my way out of the grief that I was in. And and then I had a third child, in my third daughter, and I gave her a middle name of my father's first name. My father's name was William Gerber. My daughter's middle name was Willa. So I felt that I was moving him forward, which we always think that our children will take our eyes into the future, even if our parents can't be there anymore, even if we can't be there
Right,
anymore.
right. What a beautiful sentiment that is, to preserve memories in such a way. And I think, from what I gather, you've done a pretty remarkable job of taking those personal, emotional experiences and using them as points to begin crafting something that is, of course, fictional, that might be an observation on something that's going on in your life, but at its very core, that is a gift to be able to take something that is so harrowing and difficult. And it seems like you've done it with several other novels or works that you published, where you take these really intense and heartbreaking experiences, but then you allow them to bloom into works of art.
Right.
Were there any others like that that stick out in your mind as mile markers of this kind of suffering that transformed?
Well, it takes time for the things that accumulate in your understanding and knowledge. Um, people often say to you when you're doing a reading at a bookstore or something, how do you get your ideas? Are you going to write about this or that? And or they tell me I have a good story to tell you, and you could really make a great novel out of it. But I don't have the list of all my books in front of me. One of them was called The Kingdom of Brooklyn, which was a novel that I published, and it won from Hadassah Magazine what they call the Ribalow Award for the best English language novel on a Jewish theme. And The Kingdom of Brooklyn reflected my childhood upbringing in Brooklyn. And the tale is about a young woman, a young girl, a child at first, who lives those years in Brooklyn of her early life till she's a teenager. And it took me many years to see to find the voice for that book,
Mm.
but that is another one of the books. And in my later life, my mother became ill in her 80s and lived a long time under very sick circumstances. She was paralyzed. She was in a nursing home. And I tended to her for many years. And I eventually wrote two books, one called Anna in Chains, which was really about my mother paralyzed in chains in a bed on a feeding tube. And later, the second book in that series, they were all made up of related stories, was called Anna in the Afterlife, which is in Anna's mind in the 4 days between her death and burial, looking back upon certain experiences of her life. So those, again, were two books very closely tied to family experiences. And one other one was called Old Mother, Little Cat. It was also about my mother's days of failing. At the time, I found a kitten and in my at my front door, and I adopted this kitten, and I began to watch it and keep a journal about it. And I realized there were two journals taking place: my kitten moving into life, happily discovering everything, and my mother's journey toward death,
Mm.
downward. And as I kept journals on both these experiences, I realized they belonged together. Uh, and they took place at the same time. So while I was tending my children and my cat, I was also visiting my mother almost every day and bringing her news of the family, and even bringing the cat one day to visit her. So that's another one of, there are so many books now.
Right, right.
It's,
I'm sure it's quite
yeah.
difficult to try to narrow things down after having such a remarkable trajectory here. But if I'm curious on the life aspect of a writer in particular, the way that you were able to get any writing done, as you were dealing with a family, and I guess perhaps, somebody looking back who did not live through certain time periods. I'm curious of the conventions that you felt beholden to, or at least for a woman in certain time periods. Did you ever feel those kinds of pressures affecting you, or did you feel like that wasn't really part of the conversation in your mind?
No, it was very much part when I finally when I started selling to Redbook magazine, the first story, A Daughter of My Own, I realized there were many experiences that I had as a young mother working at home. At least I was working on my own work.
Hmm.
But most mothers of those generations were housewives mainly and at home with children. And because at that time, the general opportunities for women were being a teacher or a nurse. Those were the kind
Mm.
of the careers offered to us in those years. And when I was at college at the University of Florida, every girl wanted to get pinned, which meant a precursor to being engaged,
Wow.
because every girl wanted to be married by the time college got out, or planning to be married, because they didn't see much of a future. And I was very fortunate that I could be a writer at home with my children in the years when it was not easy for women to get out. And so over those years, I wrote many stories, and I sent them all to Redbook. first I sent them to the New Yorker. I have to admit that. And the New Yorker did buy a second story of mine. But over 3 decades, Redbook magazine bought 42 of my stories, which was a record for any writer being in their magazine, which was quite an experience for me. I loved writing those stories. I thought they were original. I didn't think they were formulaic. They all covered different kinds and aspects of family life and marriage and relationships with grandparents and children. And they were published in a book called This Old Heart of Mine, which were 25 selected stories of those 42 Redbook stories. And I was very proud of that book. And I was even reading a story in it the other day. You know, if you look online or on Libby, which is an app, the reader's app
Yeah, I love Libby.
for my name, all my books line up. I just discovered this the other day. All of my books line up on Libby, even though they don't have them available. They also say send a notification if we ever get one. But each one of them says try a sample. And so literally, I found all of my old books available. And if I said send a sample, I could read the first chapter of a novel or the first story of a book of stories. And I felt it was kind of a treasure to find all of
Yeah,
them
yeah.
available. And I read some of the early Redbook stories, and I was really surprised at how fun and deep they were.
Oh,
So, but
that's amazing.
I do want to add one other thing. In my later years, when I applied for grants like a Guggenheim grant or an NEA grant, and I listed my Redbook sales as some of my publications, I got a sense, or maybe someone told me, that this was the feeling that these big organizations had, that anyone who wrote for women's magazines, in quotes, wasn't a serious writer. And all of these Redbook stories were looked upon as a lesser form of creativity.
Oh, wow.
Because I didn't, there's an essay in Revelation at the food bank called Why I Have to Give Up Writing. And in it, I have a number of examples of all the things that didn't happen, that could have happened, or that almost happened. And I do believe that the Redbook stories were like an anchor of not good news when I applied for grants. I did go to Yaddo. You ask about where do you find time to write. And in 1980, I applied to the Writers' Colony, Yaddo, which is in upstate New York. And they invited me to come for a month. And when you get there, you have no obligations. You don't prepare meals, you don't pay bills, you don't do anything. Wake up, have breakfast, take a little pail with your lunch to your room, your writing room, or at Yaddo, they even had little cabins in the woods for writers. And you are free to do for the day your work without any obligation. And this was I think it was 1981 that I was there. And the rule was that you couldn't talk to other residents there until dinner time. So if you're walking on a path and you see another writer, and I did see several, and I'd say good morning, there was one who said to me, we don't talk here in the morning. So we didn't start conversations. But at dinner time, there was a very lovely dinner in the mansion at Yaddo, and we could speak to all our fellow writers. And in those years, there were no cell phones and there were no computers. So you could hear in every room as you walked by the different places at Yaddo, the typewriter
Yeah,
going
yeah.
at a great rate of speed. And you think they're getting ahead of me. They're going to beat me. I better get back to my to my room.
Yeah.
And
But if you fall in
and
line with the typewriters, I'm sure you feel like a great sense of unity, right? And like you're all collectively achieving something amazing there.
oh, I love I really love my typewriters. I have I have my old Selectric still here, but I also have five um much older typewriters, my early Smith Coronas, and a couple that I bought in antique shops that are even older. I have one, the same model Hemingway used in his writing. Uh, and Another thing about Yada was that was the summer that um, there was a great royal wedding in England, and Princess Diana was going to be married, and there were no televisions in Yaddo, and somebody smuggled in a television in I guess it was the month of July '81, where the royal wedding took place, so that people could watch this wedding.
Oh, that's
So
phenomenal.
so many years have passed with so many amazing experiences. And yet I feel at this age that I'm still out here like this little essence of mind. And all the years that pass by, you know, you as a child and you as a teenager and you as a young bride and a young mother, all of those little milestones seem somehow disconnected from you as you observe them all taking place in your life. And now that I have reached the age, to my astonishment, of 86, and people say to me, well, at 86, these things happen, and I think they have nothing to do with me at all. I'm just watching this young girl and young bride and young mother turn into an old lady.
Mm,
But it's not about me. It's about the journey that I'm observing.
right.
That's how it feels.
Oh my goodness. And I honestly think that this might be a perfect segue to talk about the collection of essays Revelation at the Food Bank, because it does tie in a lot of these times in your life. And I'm curious if you felt like, was that an initial goal of the collection of essays to try to create some kind of framework around these kinds of ideas that you're mentioning?
Well, that's a really good question because though I wrote fiction mainly, I also taught at Caltech. I taught fiction writing at Caltech for 31 years. Um, I began to feel at certain times that I wanted to talk not through a fictional space, but through my own mouth with my own thoughts. And some of the Revelation at the Food Bank has essays from as long ago as 20 years ago. One of them is called The Lost Airmen, a memoir of World War II, in which a very close cousin of mine was shot down by Japanese Zeros in the war, and his plane lost. And 45 years later, gold prospectors found that plane and found his remains in it. And so that was written a long time ago. He was shot down in 1943. Um, and then I wrote another essay in this book called My Suicides. A number of close friends and a relative over time killed themselves. And I pondered those experiences as what had happened, what it meant to me, and what could it mean? Not that you ever get a good answer to what could it mean, but that essay, all of these in in this book were published in literary journals, Salmagundi, Sewanee Review, American Scholar, and I decided a couple of years ago to bring together all the essays that I had written about real experiences. One was called At the DMV, which was a nightmare experience of my based on my husband who had to take um, a driving test and had the difficulty with the driver examiner. And then there's one called The Harpsichord on the Mountain, which is about a trip my husband and I took to Florence, Italy, where he was teaching for a term. And we took a trip up at the mountain to visit a harpsichord player with very many amazing experiences, not all good along the way. So these I brought together at this later time of my life. There's one called A Life in Letters. There is a writer named Arturo Vivante who was a doctor in Italy, and he began writing short stories in Siena, where he was living, and sending them to the New Yorker. And they began to publish him, and I began to read them, and I loved them. I thought Arturo Vivante was a genius short story writer. And we started a correspondence, which lasted many years, and an exchange of those letters are here in my book. And here's one called, well, True Believer, My Friendship with Cynthia Ozick, which is a tale of complicated, loving friendship and a friendship that became unacceptable to the other person in it. And I describe what that was like to have a failure of a very close friendship. And of course, Revelation at the Food Bank. This is the one I wrote just at the time of the pandemic starting. And it's hard to explain how all the elements in it come together, but it's a long essay, and it starts out with me being told by a housekeeper of mine that I should not go to supermarkets while COVID was rampant, but that I should go to a food bank where they are kind to you and loving, and they give you free food, and they give you a free turkey at Thanksgiving. And I thought I've always wanted a free turkey at Thanksgiving. Well, this was the beginning of this long essay, which covers many, many aspects of my life that I don't want to give it all away
Yeah.
right now. But what I do want to say is that talking about what writers face, I sent it first to the New Yorker, and they turned it down. They always say there's a certain editor there who likes me, but he always says no, thank you. Then I sent it to Salmagundi, which is a very fine literary magazine run by Robert Boyers. And he said, we love this story, but it's 30 pages long. We'll take it if you let me cut it in half. And then I have to wait 16 months for it to come out in the magazine. And I said, no, that's a deal breaker for me. And I sent it to the Sewanee Review, which I have a very long, precious relationship with. And the editors there said, we love this and we'll publish it. And they did. They published it, I think, in the summer of 2022. And then somewhere in 2023, they sent me this amazing letter. Dear Merrill, your essay, Revelation at the Food Bank, has been chosen to be in Best American Essays 2023, which is a great, great series, and it's a great honor to be given a book
Yeah.
place.
And I have to say, as the opening essay in the collection, it really captures something so vital about the time. I think you did a phenomenal job here capturing there was an urgency, a rawness to the situation, but at the same time there was so much happening in it that I just felt completely immersed in the situation that you were in. And I just thought it was deeply moving because you, as you were mentioning, without giving too much away, you were weaving so many things in it that it set the stage perfectly for the rest of the collection. I thought it was just something that really blew my mind.
I'm very proud of it. And it was published by a sagging meniscus press. And the editor there, Jacob Smulian, said that he would like a cover picture. And he asked me, would I send him one? And I said, well, he said, send me one of you. And I said, well, do you want one of someone in their 80s or when they're 8 years old? And look what I chose. I chose a picture of me at age 8, sitting at my desk, holding a plumed pen, which my father had given me, already the writer at that age, on my way at that time.
Oh, that's
So
phenomenal.
I'm very proud of this book. And um, you may have read some of the comments on the back of it. Joyce Carol Oates said, may I read this to
Of
you?
course, of course.
Often hilarious, deeply moving, warmly engaging, Merrill Gerber's collection of essays is delightful reading. I have a lot to say from my own mouth, so Gerber confides in her readers with admirable candor and enviable chutzpah. There is much here that is unnervingly intimate, close-ups of a very long marriage, painful memories of a brother-in-law who was abusive, and um, the disappointments as well as the rewards of an intense friendship with a famous woman writer. So that's Joyce Carol Oates. Then Judy Blume said, written from her deepest truths, these intimate essays can be heartbreaking, maybe because we see ourselves in each of them. And then the series editor, Robert Atwan, editor of the Best American Essay series, said, uncommonly candid, honest, emotionally precise. As he goes on with one phrase after another, sentence by sentence, one of the best collections of personal essays I've read in years. And then Vivian Gornick and Lynn Sharon Schwartz, Joan Givner, Madison Smart Bell all made comments. And I was so happy to be respected by these very highly achieved writers at this point in my life.
Mm-hmm.
So I should be grateful, right? I should be.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
am.
And honestly, I think that's one of the key aspects of this entire collection is how you find your way into balancing certain heartbreaks that come with living, such a plentiful life, but also creating something that balances the scales in perspective in the way that you view your current situation. Would you say that you come out of this publication feeling like there is more of an atonement or more of a balance in the way that you see your current situation in life and where you are?
Well, because one reaches this age and has been through so many phases and places and times, when you bring something together in this complete, I wouldn't say it's a complete assessment of my life in any way, but a complete journey from some of the earliest times to now. It's very satisfying to see it. And of course, one hopes it will be read and enjoyed. And I'm open to any email letters from anybody who wants to reach me
That's
who
wonderful.
has read this.
I'll make sure to get the word out on that. But I do have a couple more questions to be mindful of your time. And specifically, I wanted to ask you about the idea of letters as just this beautiful way to get to know somebody, and seeing as how you use it as this lovely through line in majority of the essays. I'd just like to know what your perspective is on that now, and if you still maintain some of these pen pal relationships with friends and acquaintances.
As many as I can. I've always loved writing letters. And remember, in the early years, even phone conversations cost money, but you could send a letter for a 3-cent stamp. And I kept everything. I kept all my letters over the years. And well, now I must tell you that all of my papers are now at Yale Rare Books Library. And in 2017, I gathered them all up in banker boxes because Yale needed them packaged in certain ways. And I sent 101 banker boxes to Yale in 2017. And then this last year, 2023, another 10 boxes. So it included all my correspondences with not just my mother from college, but many of the writers whom I became close to over the years. Uh, there's a long list of many writers I wrote to. Many of them are now dead. They were older than I. Certainly, my mentors, Wallace Stegner and Andrew Lyle, wrote me letters. I put together a book of letters between me and Andrew Lyle called, well, it's called A Correspondence Between Andrew Lyle and His Student. It hasn't been published. I think that's the only one of my books that hasn't been published. But if anyone's interested in Andrew Lyle and me, it's still out there. And so your question about writing letters it's the thing I like to do most. In fact, now that email has come along, it's something we don't even have to wait for the mail anymore. We write to someone, they can write you back as you did. You wrote back to me immediately. And you don't have this heavy weight of, will I ever get a letter? And now the US mail brings only bills and ads. So
yeah, it's a bit
the
more
real
depressing.
right. The real letters come.
Yeah. But there was something precious about that anticipation too, is you're sending out that signal and then you have to wait like 5 to 7 days, at least in the old days, for, a proper response. Right. Part of the magic.
And writers off one of my novels was appreciated by someone at let me think a minute, one of the great presses. And he said to me, I love this and I think this book is very important, but we have 5 other editors here who have to give the okay. And I waited and waited week after week, and I'd get a letter and he'd say, well, editor 2 really likes it. Now it's gone to editor 3 and then editor 4. And I waited for 6 months for all the editors to pass on this. And finally, the editor, his name was, the editor who was writing me was Michael Curtis, who originally had bought a story of mine for the Atlantic. And he wrote back and he said, we're really sorry, but we don't see how we can market this book. And it was such a blow to me to hear that. I really felt depressed and almost ill. And at that time, I told my friend Cynthia Ozick about this rejection. And she said, send it to Pushcart Press. The editor there is only one editor, and he doesn't have to show it to 6 other editors. And he actually accepted and published that book. So these things have a way of finding the right outlet, I think. So these are just some of the little experiences that happen along the way.
And they are so, there's, I could pick your brain about these moments in your wonderful trajectory for the rest of the day if I could, but I don't want to take up too much of your time here. So I hope you don't mind. I may ask you what somebody might consider a trite question, but I think it's important to me because I get pretty sentimental about this stuff. Over the years, I've been trying to define what it means to lead a life well lived, how one finds those kinds of balances in life, whether it's as a parent, as somebody who's contributing at a workplace, or as a craftsperson who is trying to create the best work possible on paper. And I'm curious, as you have developed your own trajectory over this beautiful career that you've had, how have you defined a life well lived? How have you found cohesion in that question in your life?
I think you have to begin to not care about the things that don't go right in your artistic game, because you're going to face, like in any art, a lot of rejection and a lot of disappointments. And if you begin to compare yourself to the five highest people in the world, and you say, I'm not doing that well. In fact, let me add here that Joyce Carol Oates and I both entered the Mademoiselle fiction contest in when we were 21 years old. That was in 1959, I think. And she was the winner, and I was the honorable mention. So I have traversed my life like in the Tower of Song, the Tower of Writing. Joyce Carol Oates is up there at the peak. And wherever I am, I have got to say, I have to accept where I am and appreciate what I can do. And I think she's a marvel, but almost nobody can marvelize their work the way she does hers. Um, so, I mean, I've reached this stage in my life where I'm grateful that I was able to do all the work I could do. A lot is thanks to my beloved husband, who supported me when I wasn't working, and who just was right there behind me all the time. And he even has said, someone asked him, I gave a reading for this new book at a bookstore in Pasadena. And someone said to him, do you read your wife's work? And he said, I don't have to read it. I lived it. So he gave me complete free rein over what I was to talk about in my life. I'm grateful.
Oh, that's phenomenal. Well, Merrill, I just want to once again thank you for your time and for this phenomenal collection of essays here, Revelation at the Food Bank from Sagging Meniscus Press. And lastly, of course, for your contribution to literature. I am a new fan of yours, and I'm just very grateful to have had the chance to talk to you. And I know that we could probably talk all day, but I'm just so grateful for your time and for the work that you're putting out into the world. So it's been an absolute blast.
Thank you. Thank you. And you're putting out great work too. I have listened to a
Oh,
number
goodness.
of your arts calling programs, and they all have fascinating details about people's lives. And so many thanks.
Wonderful. Well, I hope you take care. Hope you feel better and that you are on
Thank
the
you.
mend, and hopefully we'll chat down the road. But I wish you the best, Merrill.
Thank you.
Take
Bye
care.
bye.
Bye-bye.